The room went silent when the Alpha King made the deal, not because the terms were unfair, because of what he offered in exchange. The royal council chamber had witnessed wars being declared, kings being crowned, treaties being signed, yet somehow this felt worse. Outside the palace walls, the kingdom stood on the brink of collapse. Border raids increased every month, trade routes had become dangerous, several farming regions reported shortages, tensions with Iron Fang Pack continued rising. Everyone feared war, and war would destroy what little stability remained. For 6 months, negotiations dragged on, neither side willing to surrender, neither side willing to trust, until today, until Iron Fang's Alpha finally smiled. That smile alone made several council members uneasy, because powerful men rarely smiled before asking for something reasonable. Alpha Darian Blackmore leaned back in his chair, relaxed. Patient, dangerous. His dark eyes moved around the chamber, studying reactions, measuring weakness. Then, he spoke. If you want peace, give us a guarantee. The statement seemed fair enough. Several advisors nodded. That was the purpose of negotiations. Guarantees, compromises, solutions. Alpha King Rydian Voss folded his arms. What kind of guarantee? Darian's smile widened, not pleasantly. The atmosphere changed immediately. Several people sensed trouble before he even answered. Then the words arrived. Send us your Luna. Silence. Complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The sentence felt impossible. A misunderstanding. A diplomatic mistake. Surely. Then reality settled. Slowly. Painfully. The rival Alpha wasn't joking. He wasn't asking for land, or gold, or military resources. He wanted Luna Aurelia Thornheart. Not as a wife, not as property, as a symbol, a living guarantee. 1 year inside Iron Fang territory, 1 year proving peace mattered more than pride. The chamber erupted. Several elders stood immediately. Council members began speaking over one another. Protests filled the room. Impossible, outrageous. She is the Luna of this kingdom. One advisor nearly dropped his documents. Another openly demanded the negotiations end. Because everyone understood the truth. This wasn't merely a political request. It was personal, humiliating, dangerous, and standing beside the throne, Aurelia listened quietly. For 10 years, she had served the kingdom, negotiated treaties, prevented rebellions, managed crises, solved problems nobody else wanted. She expected outrage. She expected refusal. She expected Rydian to end the discussion immediately. Instead, he spoke. Only 4 words. We accept the terms. The chamber froze. Every voice vanished. Every argument died. Because nobody expected that answer. Least of all, Aurelia. Slowly, heads turned toward the throne. Several council members stared openly, as though waiting for clarification, a correction, anything. None came. Rydian simply signed the agreement, calmly, efficiently. Without hesitation, without discussion, without even looking at her. That was the part that hurt, not the decision itself, the ease of it, as though she were another asset, another bargaining chip, another item listed beneath trade agreements and military resources. For the first time in years, something inside Aurelia quietly cracked, yet outwardly, nothing changed. She remained perfectly composed, perfectly calm, perfectly dignified. When the meeting finally ended, she bowed respectfully, then left the chamber without a single word. An elderly advisor watched her disappear down the corridor. His expression darkened. Because unlike everyone else, he understood exactly what had happened. And as the massive doors closed behind her, he whispered softly, "The kingdom just lost something it cannot replace." Unfortunately, he was right. The kingdom expected outrage. Instead, it received silence. By sunset, news of the agreement had spread through the capital. Merchants discussed it in crowded markets. Nobles whispered about it behind closed doors. Servants exchanged shocked glances in palace corridors. Everyone seemed to be asking the same question. How could the Alpha King send away his own Luna? The second question followed immediately. How could Aurelia simply accept it? Because that was the part nobody understood. Not the political decision, her reaction, or lack of one. No confrontation followed the council meeting. No accusations, no demands, no emotional scenes. Aurelia returned to her chambers, requested several travel trunks, and quietly began packing. The servants helping her looked increasingly distressed. One young maid finally gathered enough courage to speak. "My Luna." Aurelia looked up. The girl immediately lowered her eyes. "Are you really leaving?" The question hung heavily in the room. Aurelia smiled gently. "Yes." The maid's expression crumpled, as though she wanted to argue, to protest, to insist this wasn't fair. Angelina, friendly, warm, and clear. Instead, she simply nodded and continued folding clothes. The room grew quiet again. For the rest of the evening, visitors arrived constantly. Council members, advisors, department leaders, people who respected her, people who depended upon her. Every conversation sounded similar. Concerned, confused, disappointed, yet nobody could change what had already happened, least of all Aurelia, because the truth was painfully simple. The agreement wasn't the problem, the ease of it was. For 10 years she had stood beside Rydian, not behind him, beside him, through droughts, political unrest, border conflicts, economic crises. Whenever the kingdom faced disaster, she helped carry the burden. Not because anyone asked, because someone needed to. And somewhere along the way, everyone became accustomed to her presence, especially Rydian. The realization hurt more than she expected, not because he traded her away, because he never paused, never hesitated, never considered what the decision might mean to her. Aurelia sat quietly beside the window, watching darkness settle across the city. Memories surfaced one after another. Long nights spent reviewing trade proposals, emergency meetings during famines, negotiations that prevented wars, entire years dedicated to keeping the kingdom stable. The work never bothered her. Being unseen did. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. An elderly advisor entered the room. Lord Corvin, one of the few council members old enough to remember the kingdom before Rydian's reign. His eyes immediately found the packed trunks. Then he sighed, a tired sound, heavy with understanding. "I hoped you might reconsider." Aurelia smiled faintly. "And stay?" He hesitated, because they both knew the answer. No. The advisor slowly approached the window. For several moments neither spoke. Finally, Corvin looked toward her. "You know what's most troubling about this?" Aurelia raised an eyebrow. The old man shook his head sadly. "Most people think the kingdom is losing its Luna." Silence. Then he added quietly, "They don't realize what else it's losing." The words lingered long after he left, and before sunrise the next morning, Aurelia crossed the northern border, never once looking back. Aurelia expected hostility. That was the strange part. The journey to Ironfang territory lasted 4 days, 4 cold mornings, 4 long nights, 4 days to prepare herself for resentment. After all, she wasn't arriving as a guest. She was arriving as part of a political bargain, a living guarantee, a symbol of trust between rival kingdoms. Historically, such arrangements rarely ended well, which was why the welcome unsettled her. The moment she crossed into Ironfang territory, Alpha Darian Blackmore greeted her personally. Not with guards, not with political representatives. Personally. The gesture caught her off guard immediately. "You made good time." The Alpha's tone remained casual, almost friendly. Aurelia studied him carefully, trying to identify hidden motives, finding none. Darian noticed. A faint smile appeared. "You expected something else." She considered denying it. Instead, she nodded. "Yes," the Alpha laughed softly. "Most people do." The honesty surprised her. The next surprise arrived inside the capital. The accommodations prepared for her weren't isolated, nor hidden, nor symbolic. She wasn't placed in guest quarters reserved for outsiders. She received a suite adjacent to the council wing, close to leadership, close to decision-making, close to influence. The placement sent an unmistakable message. Her presence mattered. The realization felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Years of experience taught Aurelia to expect appreciation after results, not before. The days that followed only deepened her confusion. Council meetings included her automatically. Trade discussions requested her opinion. Regional leaders sought her advice, and every time she spoke, people listened. Actually, listened. No interruptions, no dismissals. No assumptions that someone else would provide the final answer. The difference appeared subtle from the outside. Inside, it felt enormous. One afternoon, a dispute erupted between 2 merchant districts, a problem Ironfang had struggled with for months. After listening quietly, Aurelia suggested a compromise. Simple, practical, effective. The issue resolved within an hour. Nobody treated the outcome as unusual. Nobody acted surprised. Instead, one council member simply nodded. Good solution. Then the meeting continued. The reaction stayed with her, because nobody congratulated her, nobody praised her, nobody turned the moment into something dramatic. Competence was simply acknowledged, respected, expected. The experience felt strangely refreshing. Weeks became months. Slowly, Iron Fang transformed. Trade expanded, infrastructure improved, agricultural production increased. Several long-standing disputes disappeared entirely. Angelina, friendly, warm, and clear. Not because Aurelia possessed extraordinary abilities, because organization matters, because leadership matters, because competence tends to improve everything it touches. For the first time in years, she wasn't carrying responsibilities alone. She was working alongside people who recognized her value while she was still present. The distinction mattered more than she expected. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, another kingdom began noticing her absence. At first, the problems seemed minor. A delayed trade report, a forgotten diplomatic response, an unresolved border complaint. Small things. Easy to dismiss individually until they weren't, because one problem became three became 10. And by the time the first council emergency meeting was called, Rydian Voss still had no idea how much of his kingdom depended upon the woman he traded away. At first, Rydian barely noticed. Why would he? Kingdoms faced problems every day. Trade delays happened, diplomatic misunderstandings occurred, administrative mistakes were inevitable. None of that seemed unusual. The first warning arrived 2 weeks after Aurelia's departure. A trade caravan failed to reach its destination. The second warning came 3 days later. A border dispute escalated because the wrong documents were delivered to the wrong officials. Annoying, but manageable. Rydian handled both situations personally. The problem seemed isolated, unrelated, nothing worth worrying about. Then a third issue appeared, then a fourth, then 7 more. Suddenly, every council meeting began with a new crisis. Regional governors complained about delayed communications. Merchants demanded answers regarding missing agreements. Local leaders reported confusion over development projects. The kingdom wasn't collapsing, not yet, but something was undeniably wrong, and nobody understood why. One afternoon, Rydian sat through a particularly frustrating council session. The room buzzed with arguments. Advisors blamed one another. Officials exchanged accusations. Everyone seemed convinced someone else caused the problems. Finally, Rydian slammed a hand against the council table. The chamber instantly fell silent. Enough, the word echoed sharply. His gaze swept across the room. What exactly is happening? No one answered immediately. Several advisors avoided eye contact, which only deepened his irritation. Eventually, Lord Corvin cleared his throat. The elderly advisor looked exhausted, more exhausted than usual. That alone caught Rydian's attention. Corvin slowly opened a file, then another, then another. The stack seemed endless. What you're seeing, Your Majesty, is the accumulation of hundreds of small failures. Rydian frowned. What does that mean? The old man sighed, a tired sound. One Rydian was beginning to hear far too often. It means problems are reaching us now. Silence. Then, they didn't before. The statement confused several council members, including Rydian. Corvin continued. For years, someone resolved these issues before they became crises. The room grew quiet, because everyone already knew where the conversation was heading. No one wanted to say it aloud. Corvin finally did. Aurelia. The name settled heavily over the chamber. Several advisors shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away, because suddenly the pattern became impossible to ignore. Trade reports. Diplomatic correspondence. Agricultural planning. Regional coordination. Aurelia's involvement appeared everywhere, not visibly, quietly, consistently, like roots beneath the soil. Unseen. Essential. Rydian stared at the growing stack of reports. Each page revealed another responsibility she managed, another system she maintained, another problem she prevented. The discoveries continued for weeks. Every investigation uncovered more. The kingdom wasn't struggling because she left. The kingdom was struggling because nobody realized how much she carried while she was here. The realization unsettled him deeply, yet somehow the worst news had not arrived yet. Because while administrators scrambled to repair damaged systems, another crisis emerged, one no amount of organization could solve. It began in the western farmlands, a small harvest failure, nothing unusual. Then a second region reported the same issue, then a third. Within a month, entire agricultural districts were sending emergency messages to the capital. The crops were dying, and nobody understood why. The first reports caused concern, the second caused alarm. The third caused panic. Within 6 weeks, nearly a third of the kingdom's agricultural districts reported the same problem. Healthy crops were failing without explanation. Fields that had flourished for generations suddenly withered. Fruit trees stopped producing. Harvest yields dropped dramatically. Nothing made sense. Royal scholars blamed weather patterns, then soil conditions, then disease. Each theory collapsed under investigation. Angelina, friendly, warm, and clear. Because the affected regions shared no obvious connection, different climates, different farming methods, different terrain, yet the same disaster. Rydian spent longer hours inside council chambers than he had in years. Every meeting produced more questions than answers. Every report sounded worse than the last. And still, nobody understood why. Then the wells began drying up. That was when fear truly spread. Several villages reported declining water levels. Ancient springs weakened unexpectedly. Rivers that had remained stable for centuries suddenly changed. The kingdom's anxiety transformed into desperation. Because crops could be replanted, water was different, water meant survival. One evening, while scholars argued over theories, an elderly historian requested an audience. Most people ignored him. At first, the man was nearly 80, quiet, forgettable. The sort of scholar people only noticed when searching for old records. Yet when he entered the council chamber, his expression immediately captured attention. He looked terrified. Rydian sat forward. "What is it?" The old historian placed several weathered books on the table. Ancient texts. So old that portions were beginning to crumble. "I found something." Silence settled across the room. Because nobody liked that phrase during a crisis, the historian carefully opened one of the books. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, from fear. "What you're experiencing has happened before." Several scholars frowned. That seemed impossible. No records described a disaster like this. The historian nodded slowly. "Because nobody remembers it." The room grew quiet. He turned several pages. Ancient illustrations appeared, maps, family trees, royal seals long forgotten by history. Then he pointed toward a specific name, moonroot. The word meant nothing to most people, but not to the oldest advisors. Lord Corvin visibly stiffened. The historian noticed, and nodded grimly. "Exactly." Rydian frowned. "Explain." The old man took a deep breath, then delivered the revelation that changed everything. Nearly 1,000 years earlier, the kingdom formed a sacred covenant, not with neighboring territories, not with royal families, with the land itself. The agreement centered around a single bloodline, the moonroot line. Women born into that lineage possessed a rare connection to the kingdom's sacred territories. Their presence strengthened ancient protective bonds responsible for agricultural stability, water preservation, environmental balance, the kingdom's prosperity. Silence followed, heavy, uncomfortable, impossible. The historian continued. "For centuries, the moonroot line quietly protected this realm." Then his expression darkened. The line was believed extinct. A pause. Then, "It wasn't." The room stopped breathing. Because suddenly everyone understood where this conversation was heading. The historian looked directly at Rydian and spoke the name nobody wanted to hear. Aurelia Thornhart. Silence. Absolute silence. The elderly scholar closed the ancient book. His voice dropped, almost to a whisper. "Your Luna isn't merely important to the kingdom." Another pause. Long, painful. Then the final truth. She is the last living descendant. And at that moment, Ridian realized he hadn't traded away a political symbol. He had traded away the very thing keeping his kingdom alive. For the first time in his reign, Alpha King Ridian Voss was afraid. Not of war, not of rebellion, not of political enemies. Those were problems he understood, problems he knew how to fight. This was different, because every solution seemed to point toward the same person, and she was gone. The council chamber remained silent long after the historian finished speaking. No one knew what to say. What words could possibly follow a revelation like that? Ridian stared at the ancient records spread across the table, the moonroot line, the sacred covenant, the kingdom's failing lands. Everything felt impossible. Yet the evidence continued piling up. The crops began dying shortly after Aurelia left. The water sources weakened after her departure. The protective bonds deteriorated in her absence. Coincidence no longer felt convincing. Lord Corvin finally broke the silence. "Your Majesty." Ridian looked up. The elderly advisor's expression held no triumph, no satisfaction, only sadness. A deep, weary sadness. "I warned them." The statement landed heavily, because it was true. Corvin had warned the council, warned the nobles, warned anyone willing to listen. The kingdom just lost something it cannot replace. At the time, most assumed he meant her political abilities, her leadership, her experience. No one imagined he meant this. No one imagined he meant the kingdom itself. Ridian rubbed a hand across his face. Exhaustion settled heavily on his shoulders. Then another realization arrived, one somehow worse than the first. Angelina, friendly, warm, and clear. The kingdom didn't only depend on Aurelia because of ancient magic, it depended on her because of everything else. The investigations continued, and every report made the situation more painful. Trade agreements, diplomatic networks, agricultural planning, infrastructure projects, community programs. Aurelia's influence touched all of them, not because she sought power, because she solved problems, quietly, consistently, without asking for recognition. One advisor presented records from the eastern provinces, another brought correspondence from border territories, a third delivered development plans scheduled years into the future. Every document carried the same invisible signature, Aurelia, not written across the page, embedded within the work itself. The deeper Ridian looked, the worse he felt, because he began recognizing a pattern. Whenever something succeeded, he accepted it. Whenever a crisis disappeared, he moved on. Whenever a difficult problem somehow resolved itself, he never asked how or who. He simply benefited. Day after day, year after year, the realization struck with humiliating force. He never truly understood her value. He only enjoyed the results of it. The room felt unbearably quiet. Finally, Ridian stood. Several advisors immediately looked up. His decision became obvious before he spoke. "You can't be serious," one council member said. Ridian ignored him. Another advisor frowned. "The kingdom needs you here." "No." His voice remained calm, certain. "The kingdom needs Aurelia." Silence followed, because no one could argue. Not anymore. The evidence sat in front of them. The dying fields, the failing wells, the unraveling systems. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. Lord Corvin slowly nodded, as though he had expected this moment, as though he knew it was inevitable. Ridian looked toward the northern horizon beyond the palace windows, toward Ironfang territory, toward the woman he had traded away without a second thought, the woman he now needed to find. Not as a king seeking a political solution, as a man finally confronting the cost of taking someone for granted, and for the first time since she left, Ridian prepared to cross the border himself. The journey to Ironfang took 5 days, 5 days of snow-covered roads, 5 days of uncomfortable thoughts, 5 days with nothing to distract Ridian from the truth. By the time he crossed the border, he no longer knew which realization haunted him most, the fact that his kingdom was failing, or the fact that Aurelia seemed to be flourishing. The reports had been consistent. Still, seeing it himself was different. Ironfang was thriving. Markets bustled with activity. Trade caravans moved efficiently through newly organized routes. Villages showed signs of recent development. Even the atmosphere felt different, optimistic, stable, alive. The sight unsettled him. Not because Iron Fang prospered, because he recognized the pattern. He had seen this before, inside his own kingdom, years ago. Before Aurelia left, the realization followed him all the way to the council complex. There, surrounded by advisors and regional leaders, stood the woman he had come to find. Aurelia. For a moment, Rydian forgot why he was there. She looked exactly the same, and completely different. Not physically, something deeper. A lightness he didn't remember, a confidence that no longer carried exhaustion beneath it. She wasn't simply surviving, she belonged here. The observation hurt more than he expected. Then he noticed something else. The way people treated her. Council members listened when she spoke. Leaders asked for her opinion. Advisors took notes. No one interrupted. No one dismissed her. No one assumed her contributions would simply appear without acknowledgement. And standing beside her was Alpha Darian Blackmore, the same rival Alpha who requested her as a guarantee, the same man Rydian once viewed as a political opponent, now watching Aurelia speak with obvious respect. The sight created a strange pressure inside Rydian's chest, not jealousy, something worse. Recognition, because Darian appreciated things Rydian never bothered noticing. Aurelia finished speaking. Several officials nodded. The discussion moved forward. Simple, professional, natural, yet somehow it revealed more than any accusation ever could. After the meeting ended, Darian approached first. His expression remained calm, polite, though his eyes suggested he already understood exactly why Rydian had come. "Your Majesty," Rydian nodded. "Darian." The exchange remained civil, tense, but civil. Finally, Darian looked toward Aurelia, then back at Rydian. "Would you like privacy?" The question carried subtle meaning, a choice, not an assumption. Aurelia considered it briefly, then nodded once. Darian immediately stepped away. No argument, no possessiveness, no attempt to control the situation. The contrast wasn't lost on Rydian. Angelina, friendly, warm, and clear. Soon they stood alone on a balcony overlooking the city. Snow drifted softly through the afternoon air. Below them, Iron Fang continued moving through its day. For several moments, neither spoke. Then, Aurelia broke the silence. "What brings you here?" Direct, simple, professional, not unfriendly, just distant. The distance hurt, because once upon a time, there had been none. Rydian stared across the city, searching for words, finding none that felt sufficient. Finally, he turned toward her, and spoke the truth. "We need you." The sentence escaped before he could soften it, before he could explain, before he could hide how desperate it sounded. Aurelia looked at him quietly, then smiled, not cruelly, not bitterly, sadly, and somehow that reaction frightened him more than anger ever could. Aurelia's smile faded slowly, leaving behind something quieter, something older, disappointment, not fresh disappointment, the kind that forms over years, the kind that eventually becomes acceptance. Rydian suddenly wished she would be angry. Anger could be answered, defended against. This calm sadness felt far worse. "We need you." The words lingered between them. Aurelia looked out across the city below. The streets bustled with activity. Merchants negotiated. Workers repaired roads. Children raced through the marketplace. Life continued, as it always did. Finally, she spoke. "No." Rydian blinked. The answer arrived so quickly, he almost thought he misheard. "What?" Aurelia turned toward him. "The kingdom needs help." A pause. "It doesn't need me." The distinction mattered. He could hear it, yet he didn't fully understand it. Not yet. Rydian frowned. "The crops are failing." "I know." "The wells are drying up." "I know." "The sacred bond is weakening." Again, she nodded. "I know." The calm response unsettled him, because she wasn't surprised. She wasn't hearing this information for the first time. Of course she wasn't. If the historians uncovered the truth, she probably knew it years ago. The realization brought another uncomfortable question. How many things had she carried alone? The silence stretched. Then Aurelia finally looked at him directly. "The kingdom started dying long before I left." The statement hit like a physical blow. Rydian opened his mouth, closed it again, because deep down, part of him already knew she was right. Aurelia folded her hands calmly. "For years, problems appeared." A pause. "I solved them?" Another. "Crises emerged. I handled them." The words remained simple, Matter of fact, not self-congratulatory, just true. That somehow made them harder to hear. You know what happened afterward? Ridian said nothing. Aurelia answered anyway. Nothing. The winter wind moved between them, cold, sharp, honest. No one asked how the problem disappeared. No one asked who fixed it. Her voice never rose, never sharpened. She wasn't accusing him. She was explaining reality. The kingdom celebrated outcomes. A faint smile appeared, sad, knowing. But nobody paid attention to the work. Ridian looked away, toward the city, toward anything except the truth sitting directly in front of him, because memories were surfacing now. Hundreds of them. Meetings he arrived late to. Reports he barely read. Crises that somehow resolved themselves. He remembered accepting success as though it naturally occurred, as though stability simply existed. He never asked what it cost, or who paid that cost. Aurelia's gaze softened slightly, not because she pitied him, because she had already made peace with the lesson. You didn't notice when I was carrying everything. Silence. People only noticed when I stopped. The words landed harder than any accusation she could have made, because they exposed something deeply uncomfortable. The kingdom valued her absence more than her presence. Only after she left did anyone bother measuring what she contributed. Ridian swallowed. The realization felt unbearable. I didn't know. The admission sounded weak, small, insufficient. Aurelia nodded. I know. That was the tragedy. She believed him. She genuinely believed he never understood, which somehow made the mistake worse. Because neglect born from ignorance still causes damage. The snow continued falling around them, and for the first time since arriving in Ironfang, Ridian understood the true question before them, not whether Aurelia could save the kingdom. Whether she should. The answer did not come immediately. For several days, Aurelia said nothing. The kingdom waited. The council waited. Ridian waited. And across the realm, the crisis continued. More crops failed. Additional wells weakened. Entire regions prepared for shortages. The suffering spread beyond politics, beyond leadership, beyond pride. That was the problem. The people paying the highest price weren't kings or advisors. They were families, farmers, children, ordinary wolves who had no role in the decisions that caused this disaster. Angelina, friendly, warm, and clear. Aurelia understood that better than anyone, which was why, 1 week after Ridian's arrival, she finally agreed. Not for him, not for the throne, not even for the kingdom itself, for the innocent people trapped inside it. The journey south happened quietly. No celebrations accompanied her return, no public declarations, no triumphant processions. This wasn't a victory, it was damage control, and everyone knew it. The ancient restoration ritual took place inside the sacred grove, the oldest site in the kingdom, older than the throne, older than the royal bloodline, older than recorded history itself. Hundreds gathered to witness it. Scholars, elders, priests, leaders, all hoping the ancient records were correct, all hoping the kingdom could still be saved. Aurelia stood alone at the center of the grove. Moonlight filtered through ancient trees. Silver light illuminated the sacred stone beneath her feet. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the ground began to glow. Softly at first, then brighter. The ancient bond responded immediately, as though recognizing her presence, as though welcoming home something that never should have left. Gasps spread through the crowd. Several elders openly wept. Because for the first time in months, hope returned. The restoration continued through the night, and by dawn, the first changes appeared. The dying fields stabilized, the weakened wells recovered, the sacred lands began healing, slowly, steadily. The kingdom would survive. The relief that followed was overwhelming. Yet even as celebrations erupted, one truth remained unchanged. Some things could be repaired, others could not. Weeks later, Ridian found Aurelia standing inside the restored grove. The kingdom had recovered enough for people to breathe again, enough for life to continue, enough for history to move forward. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Ridian quietly said, "Thank you." Aurelia smiled, gently, kindly, but from a distance he could never cross again, because gratitude wasn't the same thing as understanding, and understanding wasn't the same thing as undoing harm. The lesson had arrived too late for that. Years later, historians would record the crisis in great detail. The failing harvests, the weakening bond, the restoration, the recovery. Most accounts focused on the kingdom, the disaster, the politics. They missed the most important part. The story was never truly about a kingdom. It was about a woman traded away like a bargaining chip, a woman whose value remained invisible while she carried burdens no one else noticed, a woman people only appreciated after she was gone. And generations later, young rulers still studied that lesson, not because it involved ancient magic, because it involved something far more common. People often mistake quiet strength for endless strength. They assume the person carrying the heaviest burdens will continue carrying them forever, until one day that person leaves. And suddenly, everyone discovers how much weight they were holding alone. Aurelia Thornhart saved the kingdom. History remembered that. But what history remembered even longer was this: the kingdom survived because of her. It nearly died because it forgot that